to you makes ownership, possession, property, whichever aspect you focus on, I mean, they are interrelated, right? Such an interesting field to study.
When I was at the playground with my children some years ago, um, my daughter was having a struggle with my son over a little shovel, a red shovel. And they were both shouting, mine, mine, mine. And it turned out that one of them, my daughter, was saying, mine, I had it first. And my son was saying, well, no, it's mine, I'm holding on to it. And that interaction, for me, sort of brings alive how central ownership is to not just kids, but also adults. It's like one of the very first words that children learn in every culture, mama and papa and no. But right after no, in almost every culture, almost every language, mine is one of the very first things that kids, one of the first ideas that kids sort of attach themselves to, and then it just grows from there. So for me, part of what I find so interesting about ownership is that it's so central to our development as people, to our identities. It's the arena in which our most important relationships take place within marriage. For example, marriage historically was understood as a property relation, and still today, so much of intimacy happens within the sphere of joint management of scarce resources of the marital home. It's true with our neighbors. You know, what we're trying to figure out how to live together in apartments or in homes, and how we organize that. It's also fundamentally a set of ownership questions. So it seems, so for me, part of what makes it so interesting is that from the very youngest age as children to our lives as adults, as spouses and as neighbors, as employees and as owners, we are always involved in ownership disputes, and ownership conflicts, and ownership arrangements, ownership negotiations all day long.
Yeah, never stops, right?
It
So
never stops.
is there anything, so you're coming from a legal perspective, right? And if I got it right, you were working on the boundaries of ownership at some point.
Yes.
And so what cannot be owned? Where would you draw the line?
So in terms of what can and can't be owned, different countries, people in different countries come at this from a somewhat different historical understanding. So in America, so much of ownership, of property law, was shaped by the horror of slavery in this country, was one person's ownership, white people's ownership of African Americans. And that fundamental fact of American life that has shaped, I think, so much of how people today think about what can and can't be owned. So a lot of what are the boundaries of our self-ownership? What aspects of ourselves are, to use a word that maybe is a little bit loaded, what aspects of ourselves are so sacred that they should be held outside of conventional ownership. So I actually have a recent book that deals with this. I don't know if you've seen the book. It's called Mine. So we have a chapter in Mine on self-ownership, on what I think of not as an on-off switch about what can be owned and what cannot be owned. To my way of thinking, a more fruitful way to think about alienability, what can and cannot be owned, is to think of it more as a dimmer, as trying to set the right level of ownership for different resources in different contexts. So for example, children, we don't think of them, it's not fruitful to think of them in terms of as property, but you do have the right to give away a child, right? To put a child up for adoption, which is a stick in the bundle of rights of ownership, the right to gift, but not the right to sell, right? Selling children is abhorrent. So that's, so where we set but then hair, there's markets in human hair, which you can sell in ordinary. So where you set, and then what do we do, for example, for say our kidneys? Should we think of them more as sacred, more like a child, more sort of attuned to our history of slavery? Or do we think of a kidney as something that's extra? We each have two. They should be relatively more available in markets.
Right.
So as you deal with different kinds of assets, different kinds of resources that are valuable, we have different intuitions and different places where we can set the dimmer of ownership,
Right.
depending on our concerns about autonomy or the sacred
Right.
or markets.
Okay, makes a lot of sense. And maybe part of the answer to the next question might have already been implied what you said now, but maybe you come up with something entirely different. What was the most interesting insight to you, or the most perplexing, or also the most fundamental? Pick whatever you think is kind of like something that to you was kind of like an eye-opening moment.
For me, the most eye-opening piece always is how much ownership um, is a choice. It's something that is always up for grabs. And part of, for me, what was so powerful about writing this most recent book, mine, was realizing the most eye-opening piece was realizing that there are just 6 simple stories that everyone uses to claim everything in the world. So when my daughter was saying, I'm first in time, that's one of those stories. And when my son was saying, but I'm holding on to it, possession, 9/10 of the law, that's another of those 6 stories. I worked for it. It's mine because I mixed my labor with it. That's a third of those stories. And what was so surprising, what was so powerful to me, was to realize that there are just 6 of those stories, and that every conflict we have over every resource, not just kids on a playground, but climate change and wealth inequality, all of these conflicts over the most valuable resources that determine our lives, our civilization, all come down to uh, uh, people advocating for one or another of those very small number of very intuitive stories. And then once you see what those stories are, you realize that it really is just up for grabs. The answers to ownership don't come from on high, they don't come from nature, they come from choice. And if you're not the one choosing, then somebody else is choosing for you.
Right. Right. You've made that point also extremely clear in your excellent videos, which I loved. I have to say, I was so impressed by that. That's kind of like raised the bar for everything I might want to do in that direction in the future. So I think you've now already answered my next question, but if there's something else you'd like to add to that, then please do so. And that's the question of where's the role of ownership in the societal challenges we face, right? I mean, obviously one could go into every single one of those challenges and decide on which ones to pick. So feel free to focus on whatever you think might be a really interesting insight or
Well,
really.
people often underestimate the role of ownership engineering. Like, we know that rocket engineering puts people on the moon, but people don't realize that ownership is engineered in just as powerful a way and can provide solutions to what seem to be absolutely impossible problems, um, both in our own personal lives, but also on a much larger scale. So for me, one of the most powerful examples has to do with climate change. It's very hard to get to understand how to get people living in a poor country and with all where all that they have around them is the forest, not to chop those trees down so they can grow crops there. Like, how can you tell them not to do that? Why should they protect our ability to breathe? But there is a solution, and the solution turns out to be one that's quite powerful through ownership engineering, to making it more valuable for people to leave trees standing than to chop them down. And we do that by by treating forest dwellers, for example, in tropical countries, as if they are owners of the clean air services that those trees provide. So we now have carbon offset markets that Europe has actually been the leader of developing globally, where people who want to offset the use of the carbon that they are using provide the resources to provide credits to people who actually are providing those services by not chopping down trees, and pay them. So you can make it possible through careful ownership design to make trees worth more standing than chopped down. And it's that kind of ownership solution which provides, I think, a pathway to addressing climate change much more effectively than telling people or commanding them to behave better, actually paying them to make it worth their while to behave in ways that protect the planet. That's just one example, but many, many social dilemmas that seem absolutely impossible are solvable if you understand how ownership can be designed to align, to get people to do what we think they should do, in this case, protect the planet. So one of the images that I really find very powerful about ownership is I think of it very much as a remote control that you can, the governments, but also businesses, and then also parents can use their ownership of scarce resources to steer people to behave one way or another by how they design their ownership. So to give one very concrete example, when I was a kid, um, my parents hated listening to my two younger brothers and me fight over dessert. And so, but they had the cake. So the question for them was, how do they give us dessert without having to listen to the squabbling over who had the biggest piece? So the way that they engineered that ownership decision was to have the oldest son, the oldest kid, which was me, cut, but I chose last. My two brothers would choose before me. And I learned from a very young age how to cut a piece of pie precisely into thirds, precisely. That's actually my superpower. But what it meant for my parents is that what had been a daily fight disappeared completely. So they used their ownership, they used control of the pie to, and the rules around that, the division rules, to basically engineer a no squabbling solution, which was what their goal was with the pie. So that stuck with me. That was 50 years ago that happened. But it was a very early example of the power of ownership engineering, and it's no different with climate change.
Right, thanks. So, but that also means that you're more focusing on the notion of ownership as kind of like helping instrumental goals rather, and that's the whole emotional side to it, right? Is that something that you think that where the instrumental side actually overpowers all of these emotional things, or do you think that they actually then come to play together to?
I think just the opposite. I think that so much of our emotional life is bound up in the way that we relate to other people around scarce resources. So much of our emotional life is bound up in our homes, in our wedding rings, in cookbooks. Like I used to do I have cookbooks where they have stains on the page from dinners I cooked 10, 20, 30 years ago, and I still feel very connected. And it brings back the image of that emotion when I see that page in the cookbook. I think that one of actually the dangers of the move that we have today to more online lives, to streaming recipes, to pressing a button and having a car arrive, is that we lose this very important spiritual and emotional connection to the tangible stuff that really helps us understand who we are as people. I think there's a hidden cost actually to moving our lives online.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. Yeah, there's meaning in relationships, including relationships to objects. Yeah. Right. So that brings me, so I've only one last question, and that's the question of kind of like what's your own most valuable possession? And again, feel free to interpret the terms valuable and possession as really as you want.
Well, it's, I think about ownership and possession very globally, globally in the sense of the globe, but also globally in the sense of encompassing my relationship with other people around all sorts of resources. So for me, my single most valuable possession, I guess, is my own health and the health of my family, and everything else beyond that is, I don't. If I lose it, it's okay. I can replace it. But I think that when you think about the single most valuable thing, it has to be something that's, for me, it's something that's really the closest to making possible everything else, to making possible all the other places in which we search for value.
Right. So that's the question of would you share it doesn't really fit to that particular possession so much. Also, does it? Can you share health? Never thought about it.
Can you share your health? Well, I mean, I think that it, for a property lawyer, health isn't a possession, but for someone who thinks about ownership or possession in this more sort of broader sense, I think it is very much a possession, and you can share it because it provides you the sort of the basis for everything else that you do, for being able to be a sharer of everything else.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to share disease, as we see, right? But
Right.
yeah, but at least the outcomes of health are quite easy to share. Is there anything else you'd like to, on the note of sharing, to share on the broad topic matters that?
Well, I really do hope. I think the best, my best statement of what I think and care about ownership is this book, is mine. So I really do hope that people, if they're looking for some sort of like an accessible way to understand what is ownership, is go and have a look at this. I actually have a website that has a lot of material from the book on it for free. So people don't have to go and buy the book, but they should go and look at the website, which is thebook.com. It has, like you mentioned, it has videos and it has a bunch of chapters from the book on there. So there's a lot of material you can just go and look at for free.
Yeah,
But that's really what I want people to know about ownership is really crystallized in that book.